overarching theme here is actually from Crosby, Stills, and Nash. Love the one you're with. I've had extraordinary good fortune in my life to be around a lot of wonderful people in a lot of wonderful places. It started when I was very small. I grew up in the Bronx, and I fell in love with trains when I was teeny tiny. My father had been an airplane guy, and I'm sure he hoped that I would follow in his footsteps and want to learn to fly, but all I wanted to do was hang around trains. My father, to his credit and to my benefit, became an almost instant rail fan. Subscribed to Trains magazine, started buying books about trains, so from the time that I was very small, I was surrounded by both the words and the images of some of the great railroad photographers. My father had gotten into photography before I was born, and when he saw the possibilities in railroads, he just became a hugely enthusiastic railroad photographer. So as well as having these words and images from the great writers and photographers, I had the greatest railroad photographers' work on my walls as a child, my father's. I absorbed all of this. Long before I could read, I was looking at these books, looking at Trains magazine. And the idea of becoming a railroad photographer, it's not something that I chose, it's something that I became because it was just the natural path. When I was 6 years old, my father handed me a camera, and on Memorial Day weekend of 1972, we chased a train. That's what we call it when we follow a train from one place to the next, we're chasing that train. We chased a train from New Jersey to Washington, D.C. And somewhere in New Jersey or Maryland, I stood right next to my father, holding this camera, the hand-me-down camera that he had given me. And as this steam engine came towards us, I snapped the shutter. It was my first photograph. I snapped that shutter at the exact same instant that my father standing next to me snapped the shutter. So if you look at our two photographs side by side, you can see, because of the steam coming out of the engine, they were made at the exact same instant. So that was where I came from as a photographer, with a mentor and a hugely enthusiast. So when we traveled and went places, my father, whether we were going to a railroad or we happened to stop by some factory somewhere or a coal mine, my father would knock on the door and he would say, "Hey, I'm John Helbok from New York City. I'm a school teacher. You've got something really interesting. Can we see it?" And the answer was often yes. And we would get a tour through that factory, that coal mine. So this is what I grew up with, being exposed to the world with someone who was tremendously excited about the world. Fast forward a number of decades, and I'm here, living in Bloomsburg. Bloomsburg is filled with wonderful people. A lot of you are right here. It's got an amazing history. We're in a place that is rural. We're very close to the mountains. We're very close to the coal region. And right here in town, there was industry. There is industry. More than 10 years ago, one of our guests here, Drew Magee, called me up and she said, "I have this building on Main Street. I'd like to figure out what to do with it." And that's how the Moose Exchange and now the Exchange got started. Because of my friendship with Drew, that led me directly into, I wouldn't say a relationship, but certainly a fascination with the Magee Carpet Company. The Magee Carpet Company and Harry Magee, who led it for many years, helped build the Bloomsburg that we know. There are so many things in this town that we take for granted that might or might not be here if it had not been for Harry in particular. Town Park is on land that Harry helped acquire. The airport is here because Harry was enthusiastic about flying and helped build us an airport. The mill buildings down on 5th Street across from the fairgrounds, those buildings represent his whole history and then a whole social history of this area. Once upon a time, somewhere between 2,000 and 3,000 people worked there. That was a huge part of the economy of this town. So if you didn't work there, someone in your family almost certainly did. All of those old buildings are still there. The company, the Magee Company, is no more. The family sold its interest to a Swiss firm. It's now called Oren. The buildings are still there. We see them, and I would say for the most part we don't look at them. They're simply part of the landscape. But they are hugely significant, and I would hope you would agree with me after looking at these photographs, they are beautiful. Oren has been very generous, and in a lot of this empty space that they have, they give space away to a number of local nonprofits to use for storage. So the Children's Museum, Bloomsburg Theater Ensemble, the United Way gets to store stuff inside those buildings. Every now and then, stuff has to go in or go out. In the spring of 2017, I was helping the United Way one day move stuff in and out. So we had a truck going back and forth between the campus here and the mill. At one point, I'm waiting for the truck. It's not there. I had my camera with me. So I went for a walk. Not authorized. Scott indicated that I was allowed to do this. In fact, I just took advantage of the situation and I went for a walk on a weekend day. All of the photographs here of that mill were made in the space of about a half hour. Everywhere I looked, there is something beautiful in that mill. Those spaces are gorgeous. What they speak of in their emptiness is of their prior fullness. Once upon a time, there were people there, men and women in their hundreds, who were making the finest wool carpeting in the world. Right here, right there. Walking around in those spaces, there are bits and pieces of that past that you can still find. So there's a photograph here of a sewing machine that was used back then in some portion of that manufacturing. There was a bin of parts, random nuts and bolts and washers, things that had been left there just to sit for decades. The photographs of that mill don't show any human beings, but they're dedicated to those human beings. As I walked around in those spaces, what I was imagining was being there when all of those people were there. The footprints that you can see on the floor, those are much more modern. Oren decided at some point that with all of this space that for whatever reason they were heating and lighting. As far as I can tell, there's one thermostat and one light switch for the whole place. It's either on or off. The footprints are there for their employees. There's I can't remember how long it is. It's at least a quarter mile, maybe a half mile walking path, so the employees can exercise at lunchtime. Those footprints are in some ways the only sign of human beings in those spaces now. And of course, I was there on a Saturday morning when there wasn't anybody else except me. But again, what those speak about is the history and the culture that built that industry, that built this town. What I would love to do at some point, well, one, I'd like to retire and do all the things that I'd like to do. I would love to go back to Oren to convince them that what they need is a record of every employee and somehow find a way of getting allowed to go in there, and whether I set up a booth somewhere or even better, get to walk around through the plant, photograph each person at work. So much of what we live with, the clothing we wear, the devices we carry, we don't think about where they came from. That's where they came from. Many people, millions of people around the world are making things. The Magee Carpet Company made things. And a lot of the carpet that they made is still out there somewhere. It lasts forever. The company changed. In the 1960s into the 1970s, the Magee family decided that what they would do is get away from the carpet business and go into the automotive floor covering business. That's the business that Oren is in right now. There are about 700 people who live in this community who work there, who make automotive floor covering. But there were employees of Magee at the time who thought, this isn't what we do, we make carpet. So a brand new company arose, Bloomsburg Carpet Industries. It's out on Route 11. As you drive out Route 11 towards Berwick, on the left-hand side, there's a collection of nondescript beige metal buildings. Inside those buildings, there are people making the finest wool carpeting in the world. That industry, that culture is still here because those people decided to keep it going. A couple of years ago, I ran into Marty Bowman, who runs Bloomsburg Carpet Industries, and I said to him, I'd like to come out and photograph all of your workers. I figured I would start in the smaller place. They employ, I think it's about a couple hundred. It never happened. COVID happened. Time passed. And one day this past March, I ran into Marty at the bank down here at First Columbia on East Street. He said, you need to come out. The last Magee Jacquard loom is about to be retired. We're about to take it out of service. You need to photograph it before it goes. This exhibit is here because of that chance meeting at the bank. That loom was built in about 1950 by the Lansdowne Steel and Iron Company in Morton, Pennsylvania. It worked for 20 or 25 years at Magee, making the finest wool carpeting in the world. When Bloomsburg Carpet Industries started, that loom, all of it was taken apart and transported up Route 11. They reassembled it, and they kept right on going making carpet. And that machine was in service until April of this year. So for something like 70 years, that machine and all of those people who touched that machine were making things with it. Again, the photographs here, there's only one of them that has a human being in it, which is really not fair. This whole story is about who those people are. I had an hour in the mill to make those photographs. So I did what I could. When you look at those photographs, think about all of those people. There's a photograph on the left-hand side here of the creel. It's got the spools, each individual spool of wool thread it's the warp thread that goes in through the loom. There are 8,000 of those spools. The creel is in 4 ranks, double-sided, 8,000 spools. Each one of those has been put on there by hand. Each one of those is threaded through the machine by hand in the proper place. I don't know how much time that takes. I never got to watch that process. That's something that on this loom anyway I missed. I would love to get back to Bloom Carpet on their modern machines. The modern machines, even though they're computer controlled instead of controlled by the punch cards, it still takes all of that work by hand to make these things happen. So when you look at this, again, think about what it takes to make the things that we take for granted. Everything we touch, the food we eat, someone is touching that every step of the way. So this show is dedicated to those people. What I usually do, as Scott said, this is different from the work that I did starting as a child, taking pictures of trains. When I was a boy, taking pictures of trains, what I was shooting was hardware. Hardware. When I was a boy, I wasn't thinking nearly so much about that human aspect. I liked trains for reasons that I can't even really articulate. There is something about large moving machinery that moves me. It took me many, many years into middle age, which I hate to admit, but yes, into middle age, to realize that a lot of what that attraction is, I believe, is actually about the humanity. It's the humanity of all those people who keep the machinery running. It's the humanity of the machinery itself. I don't have experience with looms, so I can't say if one loom has a different personality than another. I can certainly say that about a steam locomotive. They sound different from each other. They breathe, they cry, they sigh. That was what I think had attracted me to the steam locomotive originally, was that there is something human about those machines. And now I also realize that the interconnection of those machines and the human beings who make them go And in the case of steam locomotives that are long since obsolete, the only reason we have them anymore is because there are a few people who love them who keep them going, to share that heritage with the rest of us. When I talked about love the one you're with, yes, I had spent all of that time as a kid with the trains, but now I'm here in this town with the opportunity to see this. So the art that I make doesn't necessarily, it doesn't have to be of a thing. There are many different subjects that I can find in front of my camera that are satisfying to me. What they share is that humanity. Whether it's a machine in the landscape, which is demonstrating how human beings have altered landscapes to make their machines go, to make room for them, or directly the human being at that machine, or in more recent times at the Exchange where I work, we do concerts. I photograph the musicians. There it's direct. That is a human being sharing something that is natural, it's innate to all of us. We want to share what's inside of us. Some of us have the opportunity to do that through the arts, through photography, through music. I believe that even the people who make carpet, they may not think about it this way, and we certainly don't think of them as creative people. But look what they do for us. They bring things into being to make our lives better. We don't put carpet on the floor because it's important. We do it because we feel it, we enjoy it, we love it. These people help provide that. A musician who's playing for us, is music necessary? The music professor says, of course it is. Yes, it is. It's fundamental to who we are as human beings. And the desire to share what we can, whatever we have in us that we can share, we want to share. I get to do this through photography and through the generosity of the faculty here in having a space to show my photographs. I'm not sure there's that much more I really want or need to say. I think that I've taken less time than I was given, but I almost never do that, so we should probably take advantage of it. Again, the important thing for the students here especially, what you have in you and what you're sharing with us as artists, whether or not you make a living at it, there is always an opportunity out there. In Bloomsburg, we have the Exchange on Main Street, a wonderful place, a gallery that subsists on opening the door to the art world and saying, welcome in. It's an enormous privilege for me to get to walk into a space every day that is filled with artwork by our friends and neighbors, by professors, by children. So when you go out into the world and do what you do, just remember that as you're sharing that with the world, you're doing something tremendously important. All right, thank you.